Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be with you today, albeit only digitally, at the Forum on the Facilitation of Trade and Services. I thank the Development Research Center of the State Council of China and the Beijing municipal government for inviting me to this important event. Today's event could not take place at a more important moment. Facilitating services trade will be more important than ever. This is the case because we have just gone through a period where services trade has slumped dramatically. Services trade in the third quarter of 2020 was around 25% lower than it was in the year before. A 25% drop, that's a lot. And it stands in stark contrast with the evolution of services trade that we had been observing in previous years, where services trade had been growing. It had been growing more than goods trade. In today's intervention, I'm going to make 3 points before I lead to some conclusions. The 3 points relate first to travel and transport. I'm going to make the point that those industries have not only suffered directly, but that their suffering also contributes negatively to the rest of the economy. The second point I'm going to make is that digital trade has played a very important role during the COVID-19 pandemic and can play that role also during the recovery. And the third point I want to make is that unfortunately, during the pandemic, new regulations introduced across the globe may be making services trade more restrictive in the future, which would be bad for the recovery. So let me go through these 3 points one by one. First, the travel and transport industry employs many workers in numerous countries. Actually, the travel industry is often called a people-centered industry. Now, with that industry suffering, employment has suffered in many economies, including within the OECD. In a country like France, from where I'm speaking to you, for instance, I can assure you that the absence of Chinese tourists has been noted and has affected the tourism industry significantly. But the absence of the possibility to travel does not only affect the industry itself, it also has an effect on other industries, many industries where a face-to-face contact is necessary. It therefore affects global value chains, also in the goods sector. Think a bit about how many services enter into a global value chain for it to function smoothly. There are accounting services, financial services, human resources, training, education, the important logistics services, but also customer services. All these services have to run smoothly for a value chain of functions. Now, unfortunately, this has not always been the case during the crisis and even now whilst we're entering a recovery. Now, we have seen that in the area of digital trade, and that's my second point, policymakers have made an effort to facilitate that trade during the global pandemic. This has been important because digital trade was an important resilience factor during the pandemic. The fact that we could communicate digitally as we are doing right now, even if it's only one way, the fact that we could have effective cloud-based working solutions, the fact that high-speed internet connectivity was available made it possible to continue working when meeting physically, when going to the office and when travel was not possible. Policymakers have facilitated that part of trade during the crisis, as we can see in our Services Trade Restrictiveness Index measures that we published in 2020. But unfortunately, and this is my third point, in other areas, the policies that policymakers put in place for services have become more restrictive. I'm thinking here, for instance, of increased screening of investment. I'm thinking also of measures that may be hampering the movement of people over the long run, or also after the pandemic is gone. We have seen indeed that services trade restrictiveness has increased during the pandemic, and if that remains the case once we come out of this pandemic, then services trade may continue to be hampered. It is therefore important for policymakers to take action now to allow for services to play the role that it can play for a vigorous recovery and for sustainable growth in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by giving a positive message. Let me conclude by talking about the opportunities that policymakers have to facilitate services trade. Facilitating international travel will be important not only for the travel industry but also for other sectors, as I said earlier on. But international travel doesn't only have to take place, it has to take place in a safe way. Numerous initiatives currently exist to facilitate safe international mobility, to make existing systems at the national or international level interoperable. One of these initiatives exists at the OECD. I invite policymakers to look at these initiatives and to participate in them either at the OECD or elsewhere to facilitate safe international mobility across the globe. A second important initiative that I will mention is the one in the area of digital trade. As I mentioned before, digital trade has played an important role during the pandemic, and it can play an important role in the new normal that many of us expect to be more digital. Recent work at the OECD on a digital trade inventory has shown that there are actually a lot of commonalities across the regulations that are placed at national levels on digital trade. Many of those regulations make reference to already existing international instruments. Now, if there are many commonalities across domestic regulations in digital trade, then it should be possible to overcome the differences that still exist and to make the different regulatory schemes speak more to each other in order to facilitate digital trade even further. Last but not least, let me give another example of an initiative that can contribute to facilitate trade in services. That's the Joint Statement Initiative on Domestic Services Regulation at the WTO. Research we have conducted has shown that if countries would meet the kind of regulations, the kind of levels of liberalization that are being discussed under the Joint Statement Initiative, if countries, for instance, in the APEC region would go to those levels of services liberalization and increase transparency, if they do this, the cost of services trade could be reduced by around 7%. Reaching that kind of liberalization of services trade, that type of reduction of the costs for services trade would be important for the APEC region, but not only for the world, in order for services trade to flourish and to contribute to a vigorous recovery as we would expect to be experiencing and hope to be experiencing in the coming years. At the OECD, we look forward to working with you and to jointly contribute to these and similar initiatives in order to facilitate trade in services, in order for services trade to flourish, and in order for services trade to be the engine behind future growth that we hope it to be. Thank you.